Ever notice how some of the wildest ideas come from, well, unexpected
Yeah.
places? Like, who would have guessed devolution? This whole theory we're going to unpack today actually has roots in a 1967 War College manual.
Yeah, it's not your typical bedtime reading material.
Not at all. But get this. It lays out a scenario where space aliens, like little green men and all, somehow take control of the president and Congress. Sounds straight out of a sci-fi movie, right?
Definitely a bit out there, but hey, that's where things get interesting.
Exactly. And what we're going to do today is dive deep into the sources you found and see if this whole devolution thing, as wild as it sounds, might actually shed some light on things happening today. Buckle up, folks, because we're going for some serious aha moments here.
You bet. And to guide us through this fascinating territory, we're focusing on a YouTube interview with Clif High. What makes his perspective so intriguing is that he's got this unique mix of tech expertise, coding, system analysis, and all that, combined with a childhood steeped in military history. It's like a real-life blend of Silicon Valley and the Pentagon.
Absolutely. And that's where his dad comes in, right? I mean,
Yeah.
talk about a fascinating military career.
Oh, yeah. His dad was involved in some pretty major stuff.
Hmm.
Back in the 50s, he was stationed on the Defense Early Warning Line in Alaska, keeping an eye out for, well, potential threats.
Talk about a crucial job during the Cold War. Must have been a whole different world back then.
Definitely a different era. And later on, he served in Korea, even earned a battlefield commission at Heartbreak Ridge.
Wow, that's some serious military experience.
Yeah, no kidding. And all of that eventually led him to the War College in the 60s, the place where they really dive deep into military strategy and all the what-if scenarios. And guess what? Cliff, as a teenager, found himself in the middle of it all in Leavenworth, Kansas. Not exactly the most exciting place for a kid.
I can imagine. So how did he end up getting a glimpse into these high-level military concepts?
Well, just imagine a teenage Cliff hanging out in Leavenworth trying to find ways to keep busy.
I'd probably be glued to a comic book or something.
Maybe. But Cliff took a different route. He started helping his dad with his War College math homework, and that led him to explore some of the other materials his dad had brought home.
Talk about an unconventional education.
Right. And in 1967, something in those materials really caught his attention. It was this insert, not about traditional warfare, but about this concept of devolution. And according to the insert, the idea itself dated back even further to 1947. Now, considering this was a time when people were seriously worried about UFOs and all that, 1947 probably rang some bells for young Cliff.
Yeah, 47, the Roswell incident and all those conspiracy theories swirling around. It was definitely a time of heightened anxiety about potential extraterrestrial threats.
And it's fascinating to think that those anxieties were finding their way into military planning exercises.
Definitely. You got to remember, during the Cold War, the military was actively exploring all sorts of unconventional threats, just in case.
Makes sense. Always got to be prepared for the unexpected. Right. And this particular manual insert laid out this mind-boggling scenario. What if space aliens somehow managed to take control of the minds of the president and Congress?
Whoa, hold on. Mind control. That's taking things to a whole new level.
Yeah, it sounds like something out of a sci-fi thriller. But the question they were grappling with in this scenario was, how would the military even realize what was going on? And even more importantly, what would their response be? This is where the idea of devolution comes into play.
So this bizarre space alien scenario was Clif High's first exposure to the whole devolution concept.
Exactly. It's like a seed planted in his mind all those years ago. Now, fast forward a few decades, and Cliff builds a successful career in the world of tech, coding, systems analysis. He becomes this tech-savvy guy who can decipher complex systems.
But those early experiences with his dad's War College stuff clearly left a lasting impression.
Absolutely. It's like this thread running through his life, connecting the dots between technology, military strategy, and this concept of devolution.
And this brings us to the present day. Clif High's current motivation for sharing his views, he says, stems from a specific Q drop. Now, for those who might not be familiar, QAnon is this whole phenomenon that's been gaining a lot of traction, particularly online.
Right. It's a complex and, let's be honest, controversial topic.
Right.
But in a nutshell, QAnon followers believe there's this secret battle going on between, well, let's just say, good and evil forces within the government and beyond. And these Q drops are cryptic messages supposedly coming from an anonymous insider, Q, who claims to have high-level clearance.
Okay, so how does Clif High fit into this whole QAnon thing?
Well, he interprets this particular cue drop as a call to action to create what he calls messages of reassurance for social media, anticipating that people are going to be, well, pretty confused about current events. And here's the interesting part. He doesn't see Q as a single individual, but rather as this collection of linguistic drops coming from minds that operate in a similar way to those who write military manuals. He even suggests there were likely at least 4 different authors and 4 distinct phases to the Q material.
So he sees a connection between QAnon and, like, military-style strategic communication.
Exactly. He's drawing a parallel between the Q drops and the kind of calculated language you'd find in military planning documents. It's like he's suggesting there's this deliberate, high-level approach to influencing public perception.
Intriguing. So where does this sock concept come in? I've heard him mention it in other interviews.
Right, the SOC. It's a term he uses to describe a self-organizing collective of individuals, mostly from the military in his view, who've become aware of certain negative trends and are actively working to, let's say, steer things in a different direction. Now, he prefers the SOC over other terms like white hats because he believes their motivations aren't necessarily purely altruistic.
So not a simple good guys versus bad guys scenario.
And nope. He believes self-interest plays a big role, too. It's more about recognizing shared goals and opportunities, even if those opportunities arise from, well, less than ideal circumstances.
Okay, I'm following. And how long has the sock been around, according to Clif High?
He believes they've been active since at least the mid-1990s, and maybe even earlier. He even hints at potential signals of their actions around the time of Kennedy's assassination. And to illustrate how they operate, he offers some interesting examples of their alleged influence on global events. It really makes you wonder about the possibility of hidden forces shaping the world we see.
Yeah, I'm curious about those examples. What kind of actions is he talking about?
Well, one example he brings up is Turkey's recent shift towards cryptocurrencies. Now, this might seem like a random event, but he theorizes that someone from the SOC was involved in persuading key figures within the Turkish government, both political and religious leaders, to embrace this change. He emphasizes Turkey's strategic position geographically and within the global financial system, especially with the potential decline of the US dollar. It's like they saw an opportunity to nudge things in a direction that aligned with their goals.
Interesting. So it's less about direct control and more about strategic influence, right?
Exactly. He believes they identify moments of crisis or opportunity and then present influential individuals with a path forward that benefits both parties, even if those benefits aren't always obvious to the public. It's a subtle but potentially very effective way of operating.
I see. And how does all of this devolution, the sock, tie into Donald Trump's presidency?
Yes, the Trump connection. Now, while Clif High doesn't pinpoint an exact starting date for devolution, he does believe that the SOC was already active well before Trump entered the political scene.
So Trump wasn't the catalyst for devolution, but he became a part of it.
That seems to be his view. And here's where it gets really fascinating. He asserts that Trump was actually in contact with the SOC even before he announced his candidacy for president at least a year prior. He even suggests that Trump might have become aware of them around 2010 or 2011 based on changes he observed in Trump's language pattern.
Wait, language patterns? Is he talking about, like, linguistic analysis?
You got it. That's one of his specialties, remember? He claims to have noticed 3 significant shifts in Trump's speech over the past 12 to 15 years, which he interprets as evidence of Trump's growing awareness of, let's say, deeper issues and hidden agendas.
Okay, I'm all for reading between the lines, but this is getting pretty deep.
And here's where it takes another turn towards the unconventional. Clif High believes that some of Trump's seemingly nonsensical statements, even his infamous mean tweets, were actually a deliberate form of social engineering. It's like he's saying Trump was playing a much bigger game than most people realize.
So every tweet, every rally speech was calculated.
That's his theory. He uses this interesting analogy of a fisherman using breadcrumbs to map the currents of a river. He believes Trump was doing something similar, using his online activity and public statements to gauge public awareness of what he perceived as a war being waged, but a war fought in the shadows, not on a traditional battlefield.
So Trump's communication, as chaotic as it seemed at times, was actually a form of intelligence gathering.
Exactly. He was reading the currents, so to speak, trying to understand the lay of the land before making his next move.
And what did this lead Clif High to believe about Trump's role in all of this?
Well, around March or April of 2018, he came to a pretty strong conviction based on his analysis. He believes that Trump was either placed in his position by the SOC or invited to join and take on a leadership role in their efforts. He even acknowledges that this must have come at a significant personal cost to Trump and his family, facing constant scrutiny and opposition.
It's a perspective that definitely paints Trump's actions in a whole new light.
For sure. And it also ties into his interpretation of some of Trump's more alarming statements. Remember when he repeatedly talked about the country being at war and claimed it was worse than Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, those statements raised a lot of eyebrows at the time.
Right. But Clif High doesn't see them as hyperbole. He believes Trump was being literal, that he was trying to prepare the country for a wartime footing, even though the nature of this attack was completely different from what most people were used to. A war fought not with bombs and bullets, but with information, with narratives, with, well, ideas.
Now things are getting really interesting. So if this is a war being fought in the shadows, who's the enemy?
That's a big question, and one that Clif High attempts to answer in his analysis. And to understand his perspective, we have to delve into a more unsettling topic. The evil bug, as he calls it.
He's talking about the virus, right? The one that caused the global pandemic.
Exactly. He believes that its emergence wasn't just a random natural event. He sees it as the beginning of a global conflict, directly connected to the concept of a worldwide devolution. And what's particularly chilling is that he claims to have been concerned about a potential bioweapon release in Wuhan as early as September 2019, months before it became a global news story.
So he's suggesting it was a deliberate act.
That's his belief. He points to some unusual military games that took place in Wuhan in October 2019 as potential evidence, suggesting that logistics and personnel for those games might have started arriving months earlier, maybe even as early as February. And he even mentions having contact with a Chinese herbalist, Chuo, who was providing him with information from the ground.
Okay, this is getting pretty intense. And what's the connection to the sock and devolution?
Well, here's where the narrative takes a very dark turn. Clif High relays information about alleged organ harvesting in China, with the disturbing detail that ethnicities perceived as being closest to white Europeans were being targeted in a specific order. It's a truly horrific allegation.
Yeah, absolutely. These are incredibly serious and disturbing claims.
And according to his analysis, he believes that Trump and the SOC were aware of this threat and took countermeasures around September 19th. Now, whether or not you believe these claims, it's clear that Clif High sees them as a crucial part of the larger conflict he's describing.
And how does he explain the virus having a less severe impact outside of China?
Well, he offers an interesting and somewhat controversial theory. He suggests that dietary differences, specifically less sun exposure and lower rates of vitamin supplementation in China compared to the West, might have played a role in the virus's impact. It's an unconventional explanation, but one that he believes has merit.
And he also touches upon an even bigger, even more disturbing alleged conspiracy, right? Something about a planned nuclear war.
Right. He claims that there was a plot involving a planned nuclear attack that would have been blamed on North Korea, which he believes was thwarted by Trump and the SOC.
Oh.
It's a mind-boggling scenario, but one that he presents as part of this global war that's being waged largely behind the scenes.
So this war isn't just about the virus. It's about something much bigger, much more insidious.
That's the picture he paints. And it's a picture that includes a major financial component. Now, you might have heard talk about a great reset orchestrated by some powerful elites, but Clif High doesn't see it playing out that way.
Oh, so no great reset. What's he predicting instead?
He predicts a full-blown financial collapse, something he compares to the Bronze Age collapse in 1177 BC, which he attributes to what he calls bad money.
Whoa, a complete financial collapse. That sounds pretty dire.
It does, but here's the interesting part. Despite this rather bleak prediction, he remains optimistic that society won't completely crumble. He credits the long-term efforts of the SOC and the emergence of cryptocurrencies for this glimmer of hope.
So cryptocurrencies are the key to surviving this financial apocalypse.
That seems to be his view. And remember, he's been involved with Bitcoin since its early days, even wrote code to mine it shortly after the initial white paper was released.
So he's not just some armchair theorist. He's got skin in the game, so to speak.
Exactly. And he sees cryptocurrencies as the foundation for a more stable, more transparent financial system in the future. He contrasts the traditional fractional reserve banking system, which he views as inherently flawed, with the decentralized nature of blockchain technology. He even uses this analogy of a shared digital ledger where everyone agrees on the entries, eliminating the need for trust in centralized authorities.
So blockchain as a solution to the problems of centralized control.
That's the idea. And he even draws a parallel to historical examples like the use of wooden nickels during the Great Depression, showing how local community-based currencies can emerge during times of economic hardship.
Fascinating. So if we're heading for this financial collapse, what does he see happening in the near future?
Well, in the interview, which took place in early 2022, he predicts very, very, very dramatic stuff happening within the next 3 months, specifically between late January and late June.
Dramatic stuff. Like what?
He suggests that this period could see the failure of central banks and traditional currencies, potentially leading to what he calls open warfare, although he clarifies that this would be primarily informational, focused on achieving a shift in public consensus.
A war of ideas, basically.
Precisely. The idea is that once a critical mass of people become aware of what he believes is happening, the power structures that currently control things will lose their grip, and the arrest of key individuals will become inevitable due to a loss of public support and the erosion of their security.
Okay, but that sounds like a pretty quick turnaround. What about the long-term challenges?
He acknowledges that even after this dramatic shift, there's a long, long, long process ahead. He talks about dealing with the health consequences of what he calls the injections, referring to the COVID-19 vaccines, and educating a wider segment of the population about what he sees as the globalist agenda and false historical narratives.
So a lot of work to be done, even after the initial shakeup.
Definitely. And he doesn't shy away from the potential for social unrest during this transition period. He also talks about the sensitive issue of examining the roles of certain groups within global power structures without resorting to harmful generalizations.
It's a complex and delicate balancing act, to say the least.
Absolutely. And he also sees the potential of suppressed technologies, particularly those related to energy efficiency, as another crucial aspect of this long-term transformation.
So it's not just about dismantling existing systems, but also about building something new, something better.
Right. And ultimately, he believes that the United States has a central role to play in what he sees as the liberation of humanity, viewing the current era through the lens of revelation and the dawn of the age of Aquarius, which he interprets as a time of great knowledge and awakening.
So a time of both great challenges and great opportunities.
Exactly. And when it comes to his own predictive analysis, he acknowledges that things have become more challenging due to increased censorship online, making it harder for him to gather the language data he needs for precise predictions. However, he does mention seeing emotional spikes around specific dates in January and February of 2022.
And what about these emotional spikes? What do they indicate?
Well, he points to a significant economic component associated with the third weekend of January, but he acknowledges uncertainty about the specific event that will trigger this spike. It could be a central bank collapse in Turkey, or maybe a CCP invasion of Taiwan impacting its financial system, or something else entirely.
So he sees the general trend, but the specifics are still unclear.
Right. And finally, let's address this theory of a potential alliance between Trump, the SOC, and figures like Putin and Xi. It's a theory that's been circulating in certain circles, and Clif High offers his perspective on it. He views Putin as a known quantity, a strong leader who acts in Russia's best interests. He even mentions that his father met Putin years ago when he was a KGB colonel.
So a bit of a personal connection there.
Yeah, which probably informs his view of Putin to some extent. However, when it comes to Xi Jinping, he expresses a clear distrust, citing his background with what he calls the Shanghai Coalition, describing it as a brutal criminal organization.
So he sees Putin as a potential ally, but Xi is more of a wild card.
That seems to be his assessment. And his view of this potential alliance is quite pragmatic. He believes that while Putin's motivations are primarily about securing Russian interests, those interests happen to align with the goal of dismantling what he sees as a globalist power structure, making him a temporary situational ally. It's the classic enemy of my enemy is my friend scenario.
Makes sense. So to wrap things up, we've covered a lot of ground today. From the surprising origins of devolution in a Cold War military manual to the concept of the SOC operating behind the scenes, we've explored some pretty unconventional ideas. We've also delved into Clif High's belief in Trump's deliberate actions and his perspective on a global conflict playing out in the shadows, with a potential financial collapse on the horizon. And we've even touched upon the complex relationships between global leaders like Putin and Xi.
Absolutely. We've gone deep down the rabbit hole today. And perhaps the most striking takeaway from all of this is Clif High's closing statement in the interview. He talks about choosing the black blade, which he describes as a path of no compromise, no mercy, and a conviction that the enemy's time is nearly run out. It's an intense and uncompromising way to view the current situation, and it certainly leaves you pondering the stakes involved in this unconventional war as he sees it. It's a lot to digest, and it definitely gives us all a lot to think about as we try to make sense of the world around us.
I couldn't agree more. And on that note, we'll leave you, our listeners, to contemplate the possibilities, to connect the dots, and to maybe even do a bit of your own digging. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
And buckle up, folks, because it looks like we're in for a wild ride.